Okay. Great. Thanks for coming to this talk. My name is Marcus Miller, if you don't know. I'm the Curator of Public Dialogue and Participation here at the University of Saskatchewan Art Galleries. And I'd just like to acknowledge that the Gordon Snelgrove Gallery here in the University of Saskatchewan is situated on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis, and we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'm very happy to just briefly introduce, I'm just going to introduce Susan Shantz, who is, were you the lead on this? Or
well, you'll find out in a
We'll
minute.
find out. I'm just introducing. But this was
Who leads the collaboration?
a residency, and we have 3 people who went on this residency to Guadalajara, Mexico. Guadalajara is actually, it's the second largest city in Mexico, as these people will tell us, and they've been having issues with their water supply for some time. The main lake there, in fact, the largest lake, I believe, in Mexico, the Lerma Chapala River Basin, has reached closure, which means that, and that was back in the 80s, and the closure means that the demand for the water actually outstripped its capacity to replenish, and its condition is now critical. So this residency that these people were on had to do with that, and they'll fill us in. So please take it away. I just want to make a few announcements though. Tonight is a busy night in Saskatoon. Here we've got the Body Show that is going to have a reception at 7 o'clock. And there's another reception at Paved Art with Luther Kanadu, and that's going to be opening at 8 o'clock. So just so you know about those receptions, and I hope to see you all there. So please take it away.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, so I teach in the art department here, as I'm sure everybody here knows, and then I've done a couple collaborative projects with Graham Strickert, who's to my left, from the School of the Environment and Sustainability. And we're going to talk a bit about that because it's what led us to being invited to Mexico to do the residency there. And then the 3 of us participated in the residency. Gabriela, who's currently doing her MFA here, came along, and she knows a lot more about Mexico than all of us. So she can fill us in there and can fill us in today as well about Mexico. And because her work here intersected with some of what Graham and I were doing in the Saskatchewan River and water in the Delta, it seemed a natural fit to do the residency in Mexico together. So for about 10 minutes, Graham and I wanted to just give a bit of background on the projects we've collaborated on prior to going to Mexico. And I got involved in these because I had started just in my own studio practice thinking about working with the Saskatchewan River in particular and water, and was just starting to research that and explore it, and got an invitation kind of out of the blue from Graham's group, and actually those are just a few of the 3 projects, for a Shirt Connections grant to get involved in helping build a traveling exhibit that had to do with water. But this was initiated by the School of the Environment. Because I was kind of already thinking about that, I thought, oh, what a great opportunity to learn from some scientists who are working in this area and get their perspective on things. So I'm actually going to let Graham talk a little bit about these first projects, and then I'll interject where I got involved and how I got involved. And then we hope to do that in about 10 minutes, and then we'll talk about the residency in Mexico.
So I don't know if folks know, but Saskatchewan is home to one of the largest inland freshwater deltas in North America, called the Saskatchewan River Delta, also known by some as the Cumberland Marshes. And so that's right down here. This work that brought Susan and I together as collaborators, and later Gabriela, was focused on understanding the changes going on in these delta ecosystems. And so these are really interesting places that are downstream of the Rocky Mountains. They get most of their water from the Rocky Mountains, which flows across a lot of landscapes where many decisions are made about how water is pulled out of those landscapes, how hydropower is used to produce electricity, and it changes the seasonal flows in these environments quite significantly. And there are still people that live in these deltas that their livelihood is radically altered as a result of the changes going on upstream in the places where we live. So that's kind of to situate the work, that's what it's about. We, back in 2015, 16, thereabouts, we brought people from these communities where we had been working since 2011 to understand the deltas to Saskatoon, to Wanuskewin, to have a 3-day workshop bringing science and art together to think about how we can understand these and kind of using art as the bridge between traditional ways of understanding the world or local ecological knowledge and Western science. And I am a social scientist. I work a lot with physical scientists, but I'll say that I don't think we're going to solve the world's problems by sciencing our way out of them. I think that it's going to require more creativity and experimentation than science allows us to do. And so I think it's going to depend on collaborations between people who still know what it's like to be native to a place and to live within the bounds of that place with the best science that we can possibly do and ways of modeling environmental systems, but also and especially with art, because art gives us that place where we can push the boundaries and think about what is possible, not just what's probable. So I'll say that here are a group of students developing some pieces for the initial Delta display. That'll make sense in a few minutes. So they're writing on grasses. We scanned natural objects, which they wrote messages on that were important to their Delta ecosystems. Rocks as well, trees. And then we eventually created a display. Here's a sort of zoom in on the display. They also created felted work, fish scale art, which was dyeing individual fish scales into colors and then attaching it onto these wampums.
Which Elizabeth Dobbin did for us. She assisted with this project.
Oh, yeah.
So these were actually youth projects. They had a real emphasis on educating the youth, and they wanted workshops for the youth in particular. So the little muskrats are actually buffalo fur that they brought down.
So I'm going to just click through a whole bunch of images quite quickly, just to situate the work, and then we'll get into the residency.
What I want to say about the request for art to be involved, that actually came from the communities, which are largely Indigenous communities. They said, we don't want another report, we don't want something that disappears. We want something concrete that can generate conversations in our communities. So they said to SENS, we want something like a traveling exhibit was their idea. You can click through as I'm talking a bit about this, but sort of part of the dilemma for me as an artist coming in kind of late in the project was, and they already planned this April workshop, was what can you do with 2 months planning to get some community input and make something visual. So we worked with some of what SENS was doing, which was maps, maps of each of the areas. How can we make more creative maps where people locate what's important to them? So that's what those maps were. The fish scale art, that was an idea that came out of the Indigenous communities of using, it's kind of like beading, but using the conventional way of doing the fish scales, kind of like sequins. We did a photo booth project where people said something about the Delta that was trying to generate things that could lead to the traveling exhibit, but we didn't have time to plan that exhibit and see what it would be until after this 3-day workshop. So this was the end of the 3-day workshop, and this was kind of like a signature photo of everybody making a commitment to the Deltas with this temporary display in the background that changed up then when it became a traveling display. Nicole Paul, you might remember, was a student here, and she was hired to become a visual note taker at those 3-day workshops. And then she created this drawing up here, which was produced on a print with a kind of policy statement that the science group generated out of the 3 days. What do people want to see happen? What should be communicated to leaders in each province? And then we worked with drama to actually create this traveling exhibit. So Ian Rose and Carla Bortz over there worked from that temporary display. It was Ian's idea to have these 3 canoes kind of thrown up on these tripod-shaped things that are called pterodactyls. I think it's like a theater design thing where it
Periactoid.
Pterodactyls, I always get it mixed up with those dinosaurs. So anyway, he created it so it could collapse and then travel. And Graham was the heroic traveler of the display, which ended up having to go by trucks on ice roads to all these communities in the winter. So these are pictures Graham can speak about.
We went from Saskatoon to Cumberland House to Fort Smith, Fort Chippewa and Fort Resolution to Yellowknife in February of 2016. And it was a big undertaking. It took about 6 to 8 hours to build the display. Community members helped put it together. Something I just wanted to highlight was these are actually the rocks that they had done in the workshop at Wanaskewin that were then decoupaged onto eggs.
They were showing the eggs that became nests and some of the wildlife that's threatened in the deltas, kind of the...
And then people could see, oh, that, you know, that was my map that I drew it back in that workshop, and now it's traveling around Western Canada, so that was pretty cool. That's a photo in Cumberland House. Here's some of the objects. We also had another photo booth in as the exhibit traveled, where people had, you know, my delta is, why is my delta important? The messages were quite mixed. Some people were really positive about how beautiful it was. Other people were saying, my delta's dying. There was quite a mixed perspective from the members of the communities.
And communities added objects, so all these moccasins, like they were sort of important things in each community, they could add to the display as it traveled, and they were returned to them after.
Or furs or carvings were also added. So eventually the display came back to Gordon Oaks Red Bear, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. So this is in Gordon Oaks, but there was a gentleman from the Western Development Museum Board who works for the university, and he saw it in Gordon Oaks, and he said, wow, it would be really great if we could put this in the Western Development Museum. It went to the Western Development Museum from August until midway through September, and there were over 6,000 people that visited the museum at that time, so that was a really good kind of finisher to the display. And then it was dismantled, components went back to the communities, and a lot of the other stuff went into the university archives. So these are some photos that Barb Reimer actually took of the display while it was in Gordon Oaks. This is a diamond willow walking stick that was a big feature of the display that was made by folks at the Gabriel Dumont Institute. David Warren right here was the weaver, and that toured with the display, and that's still here at the university as a part of the university's collection.
And the key message that came out of this from the communities was bring back nature's flow, restore the river's rhythm, something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly
and that was
right.
sort of carved on the display and used in the policy statement as well.
We also managed to deliver that message to Prime Minister Trudeau in Yellowknife. Unfortunately, it was the day after he decided not to do electoral reform in Canada, so that was kind of the story at the time, and the display was certainly second fiddle. But the display and the collaboration led to this course that Susan and I did.
Yeah,
You want to click through that really quickly?
Right, because this kind of led to the Mexican residency and was a model we initially had for the residency invitation in Mexico. But coming out of the collaboration with Graham, I felt like there hadn't been real opportunity to involve students because of the short time frame. So we came up with this idea of actually offering a course where students would think with us about art and water and travel to the Delta and do field trips and kind of learn about water in our own community. Just go through that. It was in the summer of 2017. So we used this model in Mexico. We did field trips here. We did a field trip to the weir the first day. We went to the water treatment plant. We went to, this is on the road to the Delta, sorry, that was another dam. We went to the Gardner Dam and the E.D. Campbell Dam. Graham talked about the impact of the dams on the Delta. It's just to locate it again. So that's the whole watershed of the Saskatchewan River and where the Delta is, right at the Manitoba border, that sort of gray blue area over the border. And we did a 4-day residency at Mystic Lodge with Gary Carrier, who's been a real community proponent of the Delta, and he's worked with a lot of scientists, and he's worked with Ian Taves, a filmmaker, who made a film about the Saskatchewan Delta, which is how I first found out about it and how Graham and his team first found about it was through a film. And then we were actually able to get funding for Ian to make a film about the class, so he came up with us, and there's a 15-minute film you can find on the U of S website. There's Ian filming, and we invited Basha Ireland, who's a water activist, artist, been involved for decades in rivers and thinking about art in rivers, and about a dozen students. Graham's picture of what's happening at Cumberland House with water.
So this is 2015 was a really low water year for the Saskatchewan River, particularly in July. And this is the intake pipe for the water treatment plant in Cumberland House. So they were actually, intake pipe was dry, and they had to pump water into their treatment plant, which cost fuel and money, and the quality of the water coming in isn't necessarily that great because it's really rich in organics. So that was, yeah. This photo is just to illustrate the change in the flow. So way back to 1913 and all the way to 2013, you see there's quite a lot of variation in flows, and then in 1963, once the dams go in, you see that the fluctuation changes and it gets pushed around that lower mark, and the fluctuation is also a lot narrower.
This is the film Ian made. You can just Google that title and find it online. It's just a 15-minute short, and it's been played in, I don't know, 7 or 8 film festivals around the world. So it's been seen more broadly too. And we ended with an exhibition here in the Snelgrove, and this is the kind of segue in connection to the residency in Mexico, because Peter Kingstone was here for a residency with Linda Duval, who's here, her in the whole residency, and just happened to drop by the gallery before he went out to Linda's, and I briefly met him. And then, several months later, got an invitation from a friend of his, Julian, who runs the residency in Mexico. And they knew each other from Toronto when Julian lived in Toronto. So kind of pointing out, like, you never know what's going to unfold from one project to the next.
Julian, I love it.
I know I did it right. I was saying Julian, and she was getting after me because I could see Julian in my email. Trying to sound a little more Spanish.
Yes.
Okay, so here's Anima Casa Rural Art Residency, and we were asked to do a similar thing to what Peter had seen here. Initially, Graham and I thought, oh, we could take a group of students and do a class, over the February break. Graham can say more about that, but there's a lot of travel issues, like security warnings about traveling in Mexico, that made it seem a little daunting to go without knowing the site with a group of students that we were responsible for. So we decided instead, we applied for funding to the U of S Global Ambassador Fund, which is to connect kind of research and faculty and students here to other communities internationally. And I was successful in getting travel money for the 3 of us to go. And it became a bit of a research exploration kind of trip for all of us to see about the future potential of perhaps linking students here with that residency. Here we are flying in.
Sure. So just as we were flying, we flew over the Sierra Madre from Puerto Vallarta to Guadalajara. And as we were flying, I had a window seat and I was just looking down at the landscape, and you can really see it's a water scarce region. It's really lush on the west side of the Sierra Madre, and then as you go east, it becomes really, really dry. Or sorry, vice versa.
That's right.
You come from the east to the west. Then it gets really, really dry. And you can see here's flying into Guadalajara, one of the rivers coming in, and then it's diverted in for greenhouses, and that's the stream going out, completely dry. And some of the lakes were heavily eutrophied and lots of nutrients flowing in them from the agriculture around, and that was something that we noticed as we were going on in our field trips.
Here's our little welcoming sign, and this first sequence of pictures is sort of water at Casa Rural, which is, it's in this dry area, right, but it's like a little oasis. They water a lot, and he is creating a permaculture farm there, and part of the theory of permaculture and part of his reason for watering is to kind of raise the water table to a level where the roots will naturally pull up the water without him having to water so much in the future. Do you remember, Gabrielle, how long he's been doing that? Like, is it a decade or not?
I think
quite a decade?
something like 10 years already, and it's been raising. And we have to remember that area is a valley, which is very, very dry area. It's very windy. It's very similar to Saskatchewan,
Yeah.
like strong winds and dryness. So it takes a lot of effort to keep that level of water right.
How do you raise the water table? I've never even heard of that, so,
I hadn't either.
okay.
Ask him
Well,
for
it
permaculture.
seems that by constant watering, but also by the combination of plants and elements in the environment that contribute to keep that water in that top level, right, rather than just draining like the sand. So the soil is being also a factor, because they cultivate in a mixed way, not just one type of plant or species. And so there's a combination of different elements, also animals. It's just a more integral way to keep a land. Yeah.
So there is this very inviting looking pool right by the house that you stay in and eat in. And there are some fish in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some koi right there.
Yeah, there's no chlorine, the fish keeps it
And the plants.
clean. So.
And then there's like plants in this lower area. Graham's the only one who went for a swim. It was really cold. It was warm compared to here, but I guess it was cool for Mexico. And just to give you a little lay of the land, so there was a main house here, which is a family house that Julian lives in. His parents come on the weekends from Guadalajara, and a couple of us stayed in there, and there's rooms up top where residents can stay as well. He also has woofers come in the summer to help with the farm, and people are kind of going around the world helping with small agriculture. And then there's some residents, okay, that's a view from the balcony up top down on the pond. Gabriela, you can talk about this moon house you stayed in.
Yeah, that moon house, it's also a new way to build, like the experimental way to build that works really well. It's sacks of sand, and they're kind of made into kind of a coil when you make a pot made of coils. It's built that way with stucco and those sacks of sand. So they made these beautiful round shapes, and they kept the roundness in the windows, and on the top also there's a round window on top. It's quite nice, like temperature-wise, it's really nice. It's really cozy and also quiet in a way. I mean, there's a lot of sounds of the environment. There's a chicken farm, some were close, and you hear. It's a really, really lovely. There are two rooms, two small rooms in the edges, and a central room with a larger bed. They call it the moon house or the moon room. It's quite lovely. So you have the moon. You can watch the moon from bed, basically.
Mm-hmm. And then right near it, right here, are composting toilets. Right? Graham removed the back on one of them to see the collection of the compost there.
And outdoor showers, remember?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then back here, you want to speak about this, Gabriela? It's the family that lives there and works there.
Yes, that's a family. It's a couple of young people that live there. She's originally from the region, and he is from the south state of Chiapas, which is a province that has impoverished. So a group of people, family from this man came here and settled in this area. They come and work for the different farms and different greenhouses that are there, just looking for a better way of living. So this family has 2 kids. They have 2 little guys, very, very cute guys. They go to school. So it's quite interesting to see how this family that owns the house are basically 3 adults that fully support a full family of 4 members. And they are, she cooks and helps cleaning the house. He helps in the yard, in the farm, and with the animals, with everything. He kills sometimes some rabbits and things like that. They have rabbits, they have cows, they have chickens, turkeys, all sorts of things they have there. So this place supports equally, 2 families, which is a very interesting way how they also, sometimes one of the members of one family takes the kids to the school. So there is not a real division between these people. Really. Blood family, their family.
There's someone else from the roof. So also just the beautiful plants, right? It is quite lush and quite oasis-like in the environment that we're in. And just some, Julian would spend the latter part of each afternoon watering lawn, the farm. So these are watering pictures. Given we were there thinking about water, right, it's interesting to see irrigation, the amount of irrigation, the bottled water there. And then the awnings over there are where that's actually to create a bit of sun shield, but where he has a lot of his crops growing. And this method of growing them under a lot of straw, like he would water very targeted areas there instead of just putting on a spray hose where he's growing peppers and I don't know what all he was growing in that area. It was just kind of the beginning of the season in February. So we would walk through that garden area to the studio, which is this back area back here, which was also a stable for a few animals. This Graham watering. Oh yeah, this was me in one of them. Okay, that's so lush, right? Like you just have to climb inside that. And then right adjacent to it, or we could see from the residency, were these greenhouses. So if you want to speak a bit about this, Graham, like we would drive through this to get to the permaculture, right through the little village. From
It's not quite surrounded, but there's hundreds of acres.
Actually, here's
thousands
Gabriela's
of acres
Google
of,
shots of it.
Yeah, you can see that all the greenhouses there.
If you go back a little bit, so this is Mazatepec Valley.
Yeah, here's the mountains around it. Here's the valley called the Mazat. You can say it better than me,
Mazatepec. And the little dot is where Anima is 1 hectare, which is 2.4 acres perhaps. And all these white tents that you see, those are greenhouses for tomatoes and blueberries and raspberries and berries, basically. The direction, that line, that blue line, here where the greenhouses are, it's a street. You drive through. It used to be a river, so there's no river. It's a river that
came from the mountains.
Came from the mountains, not a temporary river. But they say that it's been years that it doesn't carry water anymore. So it's kind of the course of the river that would be directly feeding probably Mazatepec town, which was on the south. Oh, you see San Isidro, Mazatepec.
That's the closest town.
So now in between all this is gathered is the water. And it's quite dry, you can tell. There's still a lot of pirul trees. Pirul tree is a tree that is originally from Peru, who has, there's an image of the tree later, but it's a very good tree for desertic areas, and it proliferated in Mexico. Hundreds of years ago, came to Mexico and proliferated there. And a lot of those trees have disappeared in the area. They said, Anima is that little green thing. This is what we were looking at, the greenhouses. This is the road that we were driving through. And that's a chicken plant. They produce 5,000 eggs a day. It's like 2 acres probably.
So the soundscape consisted of clucking chickens.
So what's your source of water? Is it well, aquifers?
Groundwater.
And how stable is that?
Not stable.
Okay.
So the water would run off the mountains in the rainy season, and then it would percolate into the aquifers. And I don't know for sure because we didn't measure it while we were there. But if you look at the GRACE data, which is 2 satellites that chase each other around the world and measure groundwater underneath the surface, this area all around Guadalajara is drying because of the abstraction of groundwater. And the complicated factor is that most of these tomatoes would be for export. So
Like us.
like
we buy Nature Sweet tomatoes.
we would get these in our grocery store here, and they're delicious tomatoes. But the water that is in those tomatoes is being exported from Mexico and sent around the world. So that's known as the virtual water trade. And that's a pretty big concern, and particularly for a place like Guadalajara that's really water scarce. Like Marcus mentioned at the start, that Lake Chapala is their main source of drinking water, and it's kind of at a critical point because it's becoming salty because there's not enough fresh water being added to the system yet.
Yes.
Yes.
I might have missed the comment, but I'm just curious with the temperate climate. So I imagine there would be no real resting season. Like we have snow, right, and everything has a chance to recuperate or sit or go dormant. But with the temperate, I imagine there's always a need for water because there's no real growing season. Is that
That's
true?
right.
So it's all ongoing. Like,
Well, I think it's,
is there a growing season and then not a growing season?
It's, from what Julian was saying, it's really wet in the summer,
Oh.
and then it's
okay.
really dry in the winter.
Oh, okay.
And so it's kind of a place of extremes. There's never just the right amount.
Oh.
Yeah.
And that's also what he was pointing to, the importance of building up, the rebuilding the tissue of the land
Right.
that could retain the water, because the way agriculture is impacting, the way
Yeah.
agriculture is impacting negatively, because there are not enough diversity of plants, not enough roots, so the water just drains, So it's part of the permaculture plan is to rebuild that top level of land
Yeah.
as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I think he was saying.
The other thing that goes on around here, and I don't think we can put, I actually can see it down here, is there's a lot of sugar cane grown for molasses manufacturing. And so when they grow sugar cane, they burn it to harvest it, because you can't harvest it, it's too sharp, so you have to burn the leaves to get at the cane. And so while we were there were fires going on around us like that. We actually drove right by one here, and we were kind of like, oh, what's that? Was it a grass fire? And he's like, no, they're just burning the sugar cane. It's like a normal practice. And one Gabby tried to go and photograph burns, and I've got a couple on my phone, but we didn't get very good pictures of it, unfortunately. But one of the things we did notice is that miles away from us there was a fire going on, and the ash pieces from the sugarcane burning were actually falling on the farm where we were, and there were sort of big long pieces of ash from miles and miles away. And every evening you would see that, the smoke start billowing out from all these cane fires, which was pretty shocking and not good for the soil, certainly, and pretty significant contributor to carbon. So that was interesting as well.
And just one more comment about the greenhouses, because they run 24 hours, right? People work on 12-hour shifts in the greenhouses, so they're never quiet. They're never empty, they're never quiet. So sometimes the soundscape, I mentioned the chickens, you hear these chickens clucking, because there's, I don't know, thousands of them over in that chicken thing, which sort of popped up without people here knowing it was even being built, right? It was kind of behind some trees in the wet season, and then the trees died down. They saw this whole big chicken farm that's elevated. But you also hear the people who work here like to play kind of Mexican pop music, so you also have this like little faint kind of music scape going on
Constantly there.
Yeah.
at various decibels depending on who's in charge that day, I guess. Before we went, I asked Julian just to send a bit of information to kind of locate myself a bit in that area, and he sent a few links, so this was just a bit of information I found. So you can kind of see here, like Puerto Vallarta right here. We did fly directly there, just we had time constraints and flew there, and then it's over to Guadalajara, about an hour. And then we were just south of Guadalajara. We drove from the city, they picked us up and drove us up and down. One of the links he sent me that really had an impact on me starting to imagine water there, was this story, and there's several of these stories actually, of ecocides, of fish death, huge amounts of fish death. Like all those dead fish are floating on the surface of this lake, right? And nobody really, in the end, took responsibility for it. The news article I read said it was molasses. Graham just talked about that was being used in a plant that produced cattle feed, because there's also cattle ranching in the area, that contaminated the water. I guess the contamination is it removes oxygen, which the fish need. So all these fish died. And the fishermen, of course, they could no longer use it as livelihood, but they were the ones that had to clean it up and go out and scoop up all these dead fish and then put them in trucks and load them and drive them to a trench and bury just tons and tons of fish.
It's quite sad because there was a whole industry around this lake for locally grown fish, and the fishermen that were there would harvest it without using powerboats. They made a conscious decision because initially there were powerboats, but it was having an impact on the fish, so then they abandoned the powerboats. They were doing it with nets, but in a pretty sustainable way, and it lasted for a long time. And then there was a whole bunch of restaurants on the other side of the lake from this place that would supply fish, and people would come from Guadalajara every weekend to kind of eat at these restaurants. After the eco side, it just dried up completely. Restaurants went out of business, and I think the molasses thing was a bit of a, kind of a red herring. I don't think that's what the cause of the ecocide was. I think it's more likely nutrient loading from the farms and particularly ranching around the lake. That, to me, just from being there were cows all around the lake, lots of cow patties kind of right on the edge of the lake and along the streams in the lake. And I suspect that the nutrients is more likely what killed the fish. What happens is the nutrients will boost the algae growth in the lake, and then as the algae die, they take up a lot of oxygen, and then the fish asphyxiate. So that's common. In fact, that happens on Lake Winnipeg and Buffalo Pound here. So we see that behavior here as well.
So this was our first field trip a couple days after we arrived this is an outdoor family restaurant, a fish restaurant. They now have to bring their fish from elsewhere, but we met with Evelyn here, who is the daughter of the family running the restaurant, who also have a few cattle in that area. They have a little bit of land. And it was our exposure to this lake where this ecocide had happened, and we were right at the mouth where the river comes into the lake. So that bridge is an old bridge right where the river's coming in, and we took a walk down there and looked around, and this is where Graham was noticing, you can see them here, but you would see cattle around in this area, you'd see cow patties all around, and in the rainy season this would just flood, like water would just pour through there, and it would flood out, and whatever cattle had been up higher, like everything would get washed down. And I think this is something you work with farmers in Saskatchewan on, right? People fencing creeks to keep cattle out of the waterways and prevent that. That's when I think the word nutrient sounds really positive, but it actually refers to all that stuff that gets washed into the water. So here you're also noticing, I think, Graham, some salination along the edges of the lake. And some pelicans, maybe the weir pelicans.
Those are the ones that we found out here,
The
yes.
exact ones.
Yeah.
Julian also had organized us to speak at an art school in Guadalajara, the Jalisco Cultural Center. And there's a really interesting art school there. So we talked about some of the previous projects Graham and I were doing, and then about the project at Anamacasa. And it's an interesting program where students have an undergraduate degree in various art disciplines like visual, dance, drama, even urban planning. And they come to do, I guess it's the equivalent of a master's, right, in arts administration, curation, criticism, and teaching. So a really interesting group of students. They were really keen, and we had lots of questions and feedback afterwards. So that's us meeting with some of them there and doing our presentation. The first part of what we showed you today, a kind of condensed version of what we talked about there. And then downtown Guadalajara, they also were able to point out this main street, which was once a river. Right now it's totally paved over. There's no water there, but historically that was a main river through the area. And we went to a museum. Besides Gabriela, there was a PhD candidate from University of Victoria who was there, who's worked in more public policy and community arts. So she was a participant. And for the first part, Cesar was there, he made a great contribution to our residency. This is him here. He grew up in Los Angeles, but he was from Guadalajara originally, and he had returned to live with his grandparents there. He completed an art history degree in Latin American art history, so he was a great tour guide right in this museum. And he also did digital media, and he was a social activist, so he had lots of interesting perspectives.
And one more interesting perspective was like he went to the U.S. as an immigrant, a child. He was illegal when he got there, so he has a very interesting personal story until he basically became a citizen of the United States, and then now in his adulthood he's decided to come back to Mexico. Yeah.
He is actually one of the dreamers, Obama's dreamers, who was kind of never got citizenship in the States. So when he came back to live with his grandparents, he can't go back to the States for 10 years. There's some restriction there. This is the town of San Isidro nearby that you saw on the map. So small Mexican town, bus company called River. I thought that was fun. As they dry up. And then we had a great meeting with 2 local young guys from the San Isidro Collective. Want to speak about that, Gabriela?
Well, this is a couple. This is people very, very interesting, very young guys, but very, very active. They're Joaquin and Jorge. They're very active into activism. I don't know if you want to talk about the
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, maybe just say a bit here, like, so Jorge had started this collective as a kind of antidote to all the agribusiness going on in the area and to try to raise the sense of culture being important in the valley, not just agribusiness. And one thing they did was start some camps to connect young people with nature. Like, that seems very Canadian, right? It's not hugely Mexican, but they would have them take them out to the mountains, right, and teach them to kind of how to connect with nature. And Joaquin, he's the younger guy. He was one of the students who came when he's a teenager. And when he was telling us his story, which Gabriela was translating, very thankfully, she did wonderful translation the whole time, but he said there was before the camp and after the camp. Like, for him, the camp made such an impression on him that he ended up like choosing to go into environmental engineering. You know, that's what he's working on right now. So he's kind of at a university age. And the filmmaker, Jorge's a little bit older, but through his filmmaking, he's kind of used it for activist purposes to draw attention to some water issues in the area, one of which was this.
Yes, and also they organize a festival, a culture festival in the area to bring back, the values, the traditions, the kind of self-worth, of the region that often is a little bit kind of forgotten, or kind of the idea of progress or the idea of earning money becomes a little bit important, when there are restraints on there. So they're bringing back a lot of the pride of the region too.
So what was happening here is they had proposed to build a molasses end pit, so the kind of waste from the molasses production, into these pits here. But this was right upstream of Aguasculco, which is an even smaller town, about an hour from Guadalajara, and it was right above the city's drinking water supply. So the city was obviously upset about it. Joaquin and Jorge made a documentary about it, and the documentary actually got quite a lot of traction, and they ended up stopping the location of the end pits in this place. And right downstream, I think in the next photo, there's this tourist attraction, which are these kind of natural springs, and they're really green, kind of milky water, really rich in minerals. And so people would come from Guadalajara to go and bathe in these springs. And they have those little, what do they call
fish
them?
that eat your toes. I thought I had a picture.
Charales.
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 Yeah,
We call them
and they
charales.
kind of, they swim up around you and they start eating your skin, and it's actually, I don't know, people like it, but I didn't really like it that much.
Like a free massage.
It feels like pins and needles.
Graham was the only one who really immersed, right? Some of us put our feet in, but he got totally in there.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience, but people come from far and wide to go to this place, and so the molasses pits were just upstream of this.
Place.
And then this provides, there's actually a bypass around the pools for the drinking water for the town, but the drinking water would have been just right next to those molasses pits. So it was kind of a good news story where the arts are quite empowering. And in Mexico, more than in Canada for sure, the arts are kind of a big part of social movement. So all over the place there's billboards and murals, and it's really part of the culture. And I think art has a bigger influence on politics in Mexico than science, which to me was really cool to see.
Yeah. And there's another interesting thing, that I would like to mention. The video that Joaquin and Jorge produced, it was distributed not only in Mexico, but outside of Mexico, because, like, Mexicans are all over, like in Canada and Saskatchewan. So many people who was supporter of this cause was sending funds for them to continue with their fight. And it was a great contribution. They think that it was a very important factor for them to be able to move on and to keep on fighting until they stop the pit from being built. So it's just a reflection, like I make these reflections because I feel I am not only by local, I'm a local of Canada, I'm local of Mexico at the same time, and I always think, what is the impact of my acts here? How are they impacting there? Or what is the contribution I can do from afar? So I think it's just something to share with you, because I think it's, the community just passes the borders or the nationalities in these cases, I think.
It's kind of a remarkable story. Like, I found this picture online, right? Because when we were there, it was all grown over, back behind here. That was a few years ago. But that they actually succeeded when it was this far along is pretty remarkable. One thing we didn't say about that first fish restaurant in Evelyn where we stopped, like, there was never any resolution about what caused that, and her father had wanted to do water testing, and he was told quite pointedly not to do water testing, that he would be endangered if he did water testing, and found out what the actual cause was there. So the fact that they succeeded is pretty remarkable. And they did use social media and Facebook, and there's a lot of expat people living in the US, particularly from Aguasculco, who were sending funds and supporting it. So both the funding and I would think also maybe the international attention kind of put a little pressure on the ending of that project.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Again, you might have said in the beginning, what is the toxicity, or what's the problem with molasses in the pit? Just kind of curious. Why is it so dangerous?
It would add
like a tailings pond, I imagine, or something.
It's not like a tailings pond.
No,
But it basically would add nutrients, which would promote algae growth.
Okay.
So
it's not the molasses itself; it's just an offshoot of what impact.
And I think I don't know. I'm not familiar with like molasses production.
Okay.
But I know, those would be unconfined pits, right, which would just leach into the ground.
Right. Okay, that's what I thought.
And so that would impact the aquifer where the drinking water's coming
Gotcha.
from. Yeah.
So this is a little bit of an aside, but Graham, one of your area of research is about people's values, about how they make decisions. And, I find it interesting because when we're looking at the farm there and they're saying it's molasses, and Graham's thinking, well, maybe it's cattle, in the area, and other people are saying it's a chemical plant down the road. And I think it's confirmation bias, right? Like, when you're looking at how people decide things, people tend to choose a cause that's related to some of their existing values already. Can you say anything more about that in relation to these issues?
No, that's good. That's good.
So I asked Graham when we were walking down there, I said, well, what do you see? Because we were hearing the molasses story. And he said, well, I see a lot of cattle, in the water, and da-da-da. But this family had cattle, so it wasn't the place to appraise that in that situation.
But I would also press you to maybe say a little bit more about that, Graham, because that seems like a really interesting aspect of all of these issues here, and what you were saying up at the top about how art can help put the science out there. And I know that scientists are, thinking more and more today that, psychology is really very important. How do we change people's minds? And so that seems really interesting. It's not enough to just do the science, right?
Yeah.
That's not how we're making up our minds and deciding things.
So on that point, psychology kind of gives some of the answers. If you're trying to show people scientific evidence to lead to a behavior change, the most successful way to do that actually comes from marketing.
Yeah.
So, it's called attribution messaging. So in order to do that successfully, you need to know something about the core values of the people that you're messaging to, and then you have to align the result of your research with those values. And that's, it seems like, well, isn't that just spin?
Yeah, right.
Not really, because you could still use the same scientific finding, but to align that message that you want people to receive, I might use the same evidence, but a different message for Susan that reflects her values, and a different message for Gabby that reflects her values, because they may be a little bit different.
Right.
So in the work that we're doing, we're trying to understand, what are the core values? How do those core values influence how people make decisions about how they manage water? And what happens when we bring evidence into the decision-making process in different forms? So it might be that when we can make the link between values and decisions, and it's not always easy and straightforward to do that, but in the places where we can, what happens if we present our evidence through artistic expression, or we present it through a scientific statement of uncertainty, or we present it through a story from an elder? How do people respond to those different messages in the decision pathway? Does it change what they do? That's kind of the work that I'm working on. And so working with artists is great because sometimes they'll come up with a way of representing our findings that I never would have dreamed of. But it's about creating the space for them to do what they do best, which is creating art without too many restrictions. Just saying, here's what we learned. What do you think? And what would you like to create out of that? So that it's unconstrained
It's more visual.
It's really important that as a scientist, I see the value in their work in and of itself, forgetting about its utility for what I'm trying to do, because if I impose that utility on them, it'll constrain the art too much and they won't be able to create something that they really want to create.
So you can see why he's fun to work with, right?
Absolutely. Because I would think that was somewhat rare, actually, for scientists to not be using art in a very instrumental way,
Didactic.
right?
Well, I get it the other way, because I'm a social scientist, but I'm surrounded by physical scientists. And so the social scientists all come to me and they say, you understand people.
Yeah.
So
He's a
you
physical
can,
scientist. Right?
yeah, so
Yeah.
you can obviously communicate our evidence to those people.
Right.
And I say, well, yeah, I probably can, but it's not really what I do, but that's often how I'm approached.
I see.
And all
Yeah.
social scientists who work with physical scientists, that's how the relationship starts, is out of utility.
Right.
But
How
when
can
they
I
realize,
use you?
oh, actually they have something to offer beyond the utility, and their work has its own intrinsic value, then the collaborations become much more meaningful. I've been going through that, and then I started working with the Department of Drama in 2014 on a play, and I quickly realized, I have this idea in my head of what I think this is going to look like. It's going to look nothing like that when it's done, and I have to leave that space for people to create, otherwise it won't work. Yeah.
So when Graham said things like that to the class, the Becoming Water class, I mean, we were all a little more skeptical than he is, right, about the power of art. And so it's interesting because working with scientists for me, when I did the Delta project with them, they end up with a policy statement, my God, right, that they're delivering to government. I think from an artist's point of view, wow, that's really powerful, it actually is making a link. Whereas when I look at artists working in social practice areas, there often isn't that link, right? So working with scientists, it's well, there's a link, but I think you would have the same kind of cynicism, if I want to call it that, about science.
Totally.
You deliver it, and then what happens,
Yeah.
right? Where does it go? So it's interesting working across disciplines to see those different perspectives. So now we're back to the studio part here, and this is the studio. So a little here, and then the stable beside it, and some critters that you might meet later who are buying and hee-hawing and stuff outside there. And then when you go in, there's a couple rooms, kind of loosely divided like that. There's a little dark room behind here. There's some tables and easels, and a clay space back here at the back, which is some of the work we did just because it was a local material that we were working with. Here's Sarab, who came from Victoria, and she was doing some writing, which I helped her calligraphy into a kind of paper format there. The clay is a local clay from, I think, east of Guadalajara that Julian had gotten, and we actually processed it, Graham processed it, breaking it down, really, really fine, and then sieving it, and then adding water and kneading it, and actually making the clay sort of from scratch, right, locally dug clay. And then Julian also had these artisans come. They make fabulous stuff out of this clay, which, as we discovered working with it, doesn't have a great deal of plasticity. It's kind of dry and a little bit crumbly, so you have to work with it in a bit of a different way than how we work with our clay. But this is what they managed to make. This is not our work. This is some stuff they did. But it was fun to just kind of play around with it and see what we could do.
Quite difficult to work with. And it's a very specific technique to get those tones and that glossiness and whatnot. It's quite a
Yeah, so this burnishing process, and there was a little gourd there full of stones for burnishing, and I thought it was about creating a nice surface, but it really was about strengthening the clay. Like you had to burnish and burnish and burnish, and then re-burnish, and that's partly how the clay became strong, because it didn't have a lot of elasticity in it. And then we put some oxides on it that he had there, and then the kiln, the process of some of them were just placed in the kiln, some of them were wrapped around donkey dung right here. And in tin foil, they look like roasting potatoes, but there was clay inside there. And then stacked into this kiln from the top with old shards of plates put over top. So it's kind of a smoking process, like a pretty low fire, because it's just done with a fire below. This is the kiln. So this was a traditional kiln that William built with the artisans right outside the studio. We did do some potatoes.
Yes.
And then it's he hasn't done a lot of firing, so it's a little hard to control the heat temperature there. So the smoking we were hoping would happen, actually the fire got too hot and it sort of went through the smoke phase and then burned off a lot of the smoke. So things came out a little more in this kind of, sort of heat marked area. It's still kind of interesting. It's like a bit of a chance way of glazing, and finishing and firing the clay.
We went with the tin foil.
The tin foil, I think I might have wrapped some of these little pieces in tin foil. Some of the flatter ones were harder to wrap in the tin foil. So I thought they would get black and smoky, right? And they were sort of red and golden, which still was kind of interesting.
That's
Graham's water deficit.
Yeah, that's Thirsty World. So it's a big tongue.
It looks like the cow
drinking up
tongue.
Yeah.
I didn't know what was going to happen, and this was a great experience for me because I don't normally create the art, but I work with different artists. But this time I thought, well, let's give it a try, and I started making something and then just letting it emerge. I didn't know what it was going to be, and then this sort of started looking, when it started to dry, it started looking like a tongue, and I was like, oh, maybe I can do something with this. Then I made the bowl, and I thought, oh, well, I'll cut it in half and make it look like a world. You can't, the bottom part, it's like half the world. But just going through the whole process of bashing the clay, mixing it with the water, going through that whole process and the time that it took was a really good awakening for me that, this is what the artists that I'm working with, they go through this whole process to get to that finished product. I normally just see the finished product and then figure out how to put it all together, but that was a really great awakening. Yeah.
So these are just at the end. We had there's a little big table outside underneath the porch veranda. We just put our stuff out there and had kind of concluding things. So those were a few of the things. Some of which I left a couple pieces there. Brought something back I was working on. This piece I had in the pump house show. This was kind of related to me from the start with this fish that had died, right? These tons of fish really stayed with me as an image. And then I found out the kind of fish was called a popoche chub, and it's actually about that size. They're quite small. So I found an early, like a science researcher in Mexico who had done research around fish, and it was like an early engraving drawing of that particular fish that I used to make that bookwork, which I just sent back to Mexico for a display, because Julian from the Residencies, he puts on an exhibition each fall at a gallery in Guadalajara. So, and these were, here's some of the animals, the donkey. And this is Graham's. He was doing this for his daughter, right? He took her little stuffy, and then he would do a little send every day to her. The stuffy. So that was fun, like the chandelier one. And this is kind of the eating area, the kitchen.
Sorry, that's the highlight of the Residency.
Good food. So Julian, besides being an artist and having trained as an artist, he worked in hospitality in Toronto for quite a while, so he's a really good cook and really enjoys cooking and being a host. And then these are his parents, who came out on weekends, and their little dog. And this is Cesar, who we mentioned, who was there for the first part of the residency.
So we could have this wonderful breakfast, lunch, dinner every day, with really locally, a lot of the local ingredients, a lot of the, traditional cheese, traditional tortillas, like fresh water with fruit and whatnot. And it was they're really great hosts, and they their house as well, is built in a way that using a lot of the traditional ways of building, these adobe bricks made with mud and straw, from the local area, and tiles, from the region. So it's a very, very pleasant place.
So there's kind of a living room area there, hangout area. This is really in right here. And let's see. Oh, Gabriela's tree.
That's my tree.
Is it gonna go or not?
Play it.
Trying to make it go.
I don't know. It have to be.
It waves.
It
This
waves.
is her
Oh.
blue tree.
Yes. Okay. It's another highlight.
Oh, yes.
So the sound is the sound. It was a beautiful sound. We could only get the sound of the wind where I was. It's a very, very big tree. That's the tree that I was mentioning that originally came from Peru and proliferated in Mexico because it's great for desertic areas. And it's kind of a hairy tree and has these little fruits that are like peppercorns, reddish peppercorns. Sometimes they use it as, they call it pink pepper. They use it as a substitute of pepper. It's not the same taste. So this is just a story of my childhood. I used to go to the orthopedist hospital with my mother. We would take the bus and then we walk a few blocks. And there was a big boulevard with a lot of these trees aligned, And this beautiful movement and this walk with my mother when I was a child. It was just like every time I went to this. That's the kid that came, and then I started talking to him. So that walk was for me memorable. And one day I told my mother, from all these trees, this one is mine. So after that day, every time we walked to the appointment for, to check my boots or whatever, we would stop in that tree. Used to, let's stop in your tree, and we would stop and talk a little bit, and then continue our walk. So that's a tree that brings me back to my roots, and that was really wonderful to find it in Casa Rural, which is at the center of the property, in between the two houses, beside all the farming, all the permaculture farm, and it symbolizes to me this dryness of this land, but also this aliveness and this constant movement that kind of remind us that things, even though sometimes look difficult, they can keep on growing and raising. Yeah. So that's Pirul.